Ethan Carter's day always began before sunrise. A decorated military veteran turned diligent city official, he'd spent years serving his country and now served his community with equal passion. Every morning, as he sipped his black coffee on the front step of his cherished suburban home, he admired the gentle glow of his porch lights, a small beacon of his hard-won freedom and independence. His home was more than a shelter. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could tinker on classic cars in his workshop and reminisce about his days of honor in uniform. Ethan's property was a quiet haven tucked away on a tree-lined street where each house bore character and pride. The sprawling lawn, the neat hedges, and even the slightly battered but lovingly restored vintage Ford in the driveway symbolized his personal commitment to quality, authenticity, and justice. Yet, as peaceful as his world seemed, trouble was already brewing in the form of Karen, a woman whose self-appointed role as HOA queen bordered on tyranny. Karen wasn't always a stranger on the block. Rumors swirled among the neighbors about her rapid rise to power once she'd taken the reins as HOA president. With a penchant for issuing arbitrary rules and a glare that could freeze even the most confident homeowner in place, Karen was infamous for enforcing regulations that bordered on the absurd. Her latest target? Ethan's property, specifically his warm, welcoming porch lights that he claimed added to the curb appeal of the neighborhood. One crisp autumn morning, as golden sunlight dappled the dewy grass, Ethan found himself on the doorstep, admiring his handiwork on an old Chevy engine. Out of nowhere, there was a knock on the door. Opening it, he was met by Karen's steely eyes and a clipboard clutched in her gloved hand. "Ethan Carter," Karen began in a tone that brooked no argument, "your porch lights are too bright. They violate our community's aesthetic guidelines. This is your final warning before further action is taken." Ethan frowned. "I'm sorry, Karen, but I believe you've got the wrong idea. These lights are part of my home's character. They're welcoming. I haven't signed up for any HOA rules that dictate how I decorate my property." Karen's smile was tight and condescending. "The rules apply to everyone equally, whether you like it or not. Our community deserves order and uniformity, and I'm here to enforce it." Her eyes sparkled with a mix of self-importance and unyielding authority. In that moment, Ethan realized that his sanctuary was about to be invaded by the very entity that was supposed to protect neighborhood interests. He recalled the countless stories whispered among residents, tales of steep fines, unjust demands, and invasive inspections. Though Ethan's record with city authorities was spotless, Karen's overreach made him feel both personally and professionally affronted. That confrontation marked the start of an escalating battle between Ethan's principled stand and an HOA run by entitlement. As Karen walked away with her clipboard, leaving behind a trail of unspoken threats, Ethan closed the door and muttered, "This isn't over." Later that day, as he reviewed zoning ordinances in his modest home office, Ethan's mind churned over Karen's claims. How could a board, led by a self-styled enforcer, claim jurisdiction over something as personal as his porch lights? His home was his castle, and he'd long ago learned that real power came from knowing and standing by the law. And Ethan knew the law. Even as he prepared for the day ahead, the uneasy feeling of being ambushed by overzealous regulations lingered. Every flicker of his porch light now seemed to scream rebellion. And though the neighborhood prided itself on tradition and order, Ethan's encounter with Karen was the harbinger of a conflict that would soon shake the community to its core. In hushed tones, some neighbors began to speculate about Ethan's potential as a reluctant hero, a man who had both the authority and the resolve to take on an unjust system. For Ethan, it wasn't about notoriety. It was about doing what was right, regardless of the consequences. That evening, as twilight draped the neighborhood in soft blues and grays, he prepared for what would be a long, grueling battle with the HOA. The line between neighborly niceties and authoritarian control had been drawn, and Ethan was ready to defend every inch of his home. The following morning, Ethan awoke to an ominous surprise, a bright yellow envelope, taped to his front door like an unwelcome visitor. With a deep breath, he opened it and unfolded the letter. A formal notice of violation accompanied by a $750 fine for excessive brightness and noncompliance with community aesthetic standards. Karen's authoritative signature was stamped at the bottom, as if that alone justified the penalty. Standing on his porch, Ethan held the letter in one hand and his mug in the other. His pulse quickened as he reread the text. "I never consented to any such regulation," he murmured. "This is a blatant abuse of power." Later that day, Karen was already on the scene. Leaning against the brick wall outside his driveway, she surveyed the situation with a smug satisfaction. "Ethan, you can't just ignore this notice," she said coolly, arms folded as if she were the arbiter of all neighborhood decorum. "The rules are clear. You must comply, or the next steps will be far more serious." Ethan, resolute in his knowledge of local laws, replied calmly, "I understand the community guidelines, Karen, but these so-called rules are neither written in stone nor legally binding. I'm well aware of the ordinances that protect my property rights." His tone was even but carried the weight of authority gleaned from years of public service. Karen's face darkened. "I'm not here to negotiate. The HOA's regulations are absolute, and if you don't comply, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter." She tapped her clipboard decisively, her eyes flashing with the promise of more fines and restrictions. "We've already arranged for an inspector to come by later today to verify your noncompliance." Not long after, an unmarked vehicle cruised up the street. A pair of stern-faced inspectors stepped out, clipboard in hand, inspecting every nook and cranny of Ethan's property. While they made their rounds, Karen hovered nearby, enjoying every moment of his discomfort. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she repeated, her tone now edged with triumph. Ethan calmly took notes on the inspector's questions and explained his understanding of the local zoning laws. With every question, his responses grew more detailed, drawing on his years of experience as a city official. When the inspector mentioned the possibility of further legal action, Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the zoning office," he said firmly, "and I suggest the HOA review its procedures immediately." As the inspectors left, the tension in the air was palpable. Karen, however, was undeterred. "You're making a mistake, Ethan," she hissed. "I'll be keeping a very close eye on you. Any further defiance, and the next move might involve legal threats or even property seizure." The fine was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, Ethan found another envelope tucked into his mailbox, a follow-up notice warning him that further noncompliance could result in additional fines and even a civil suit. Each piece of correspondence was written in a tone that mixed bureaucratic indifference with personal spite. Back in his home office, surrounded by law books and municipal codes, Ethan pored over every document he could find. His experience in public service gave him a clear understanding. Karen was leveraging her position to bully a citizen who knew his rights. The fine, the inspectors, the relentless follow-up, everything pointed to a systematic abuse of power by an HOA that had lost its way. Later that evening, as dusk settled and the street lights flickered on, Ethan sat at his kitchen table drafting a formal letter of protest. He carefully cited local ordinances and documented every irregularity in the HOA's actions. "This isn't about aesthetics," he wrote. "It's about a fundamental right to privacy and property. I am a law-abiding citizen and a city official who has seen firsthand what happens when those in power abuse it." As he sealed the envelope with a decisive stamp, he couldn't help but feel that this was only the opening round in a much larger battle. Karen's smug assurance was beginning to crumble in the face of evidence and legal precedent. Even as Karen's threats echoed in his mind, Ethan knew he was prepared to fight back, not just for himself, but for every neighbor who had ever felt bullied by an overreaching authority. The day ended with a mix of determination and unease. Ethan realized that this confrontation with Karen wasn't a mere disagreement over porch lights. It was a battle for justice and respect. And as he set his pen down, he made a silent vow. He would stand up for what was right, no matter how high the fines or how relentless the HOA's power moves might become. In the days that followed, an unsettling pattern emerged. Ethan began noticing subtle and not so subtle tactics designed to unsettle him. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks and whispered in hushed tones about how Karen's methods were never ordinary. Late one afternoon, as Ethan was checking his mail, A timid knock at his door revealed an anxious neighbor. "Ethan, you've got to be careful," the neighbor confided, voice trembling. "I heard that Karen is issuing fake violations left and right, and some of the fines just disappear when you donate to the HOA fund." At first, Ethan dismissed the rumor as small-town gossip. But as he reviewed further correspondence from the HOA, a series of notices that seemed more like scare tactics than genuine enforcement, he couldn't ignore the red flags. Documents cited bizarre violations: a misplaced garden gnome here, an unauthorized bird feeder there. The absurdity of it all grew even more obvious when one board member, whom Ethan met briefly at a previous community meeting, pulled him aside in the parking lot. "Look, Ethan," the board member whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "I'm not comfortable with how Karen is handling things. I've seen accounts of HOA funds being used for personal expenses, vacations, luxury spas. You might want to document everything." Fueled by this insider tip, Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. He installed discreet cameras around his property, not to invade his own privacy, but to document any attempts at harassment. Late at night, he'd watch the recordings, noting the times when inspectors appeared unannounced or when mysterious figures circled his home. Every clip added another layer to the disturbing picture of an HOA that was no longer about maintaining a neighborhood, but about consolidating power. Meanwhile, Karen's tactics grew bolder. One day, Ethan returned home to find his mailbox replaced with one bearing the HOA crest, an unmistakable signal that the organization was now claiming full dominion over even his smallest property features. A few days later, he received a notice threatening eviction on the grounds of continuous noncompliance and disturbing the community's peace. The threat was absurd, and yet it was delivered with a cold efficiency that left Ethan with an uneasy feeling in his gut. At the next board meeting, tensions boiled over. The community hall, usually a modest room filled with polite chatter, became a battleground. Ethan, armed with his meticulously kept records and clear legal documents, took the floor. "I've received notice after notice that are not only unfounded but downright illegal," he announced, projecting his voice so all could hear. "Our HOA is supposed to serve us, not intimidate us." A murmur ran through the room. Some board members exchanged glances that spoke of hidden doubts about Karen's decisions. But Karen, perched at the head of the table with a defiant smile, interrupted sharply. "These are your responsibilities as a homeowner. If you can't abide by the rules, then perhaps you're not a good fit for our community." Her tone was icy and unyielding. Ethan countered, "The rules aren't written in stone. They're guidelines meant to maintain harmony, not to oppress." His words resonated with a few residents who had long harbored silent resentment. One board member even shifted uncomfortably, hinting that maybe Karen's strict enforcement wasn't the only way. Later that evening, Ethan compiled his evidence: a series of recorded visits, copies of conflicting notices, and witness testimonies. Every detail painted a picture of corruption and intimidation. With resolve hardening in his chest, he began drafting a plan for a counterattack. Not one of violence or chaos, but one built firmly on legal grounds and community solidarity. In the quiet solitude of his garage, surrounded by the scent of motor oil and old leather, Ethan reviewed the footage once more. Each frame was a reminder that Karen's abuse of power was systematic. And with every clip, his determination grew stronger. He knew that if he could expose these irregularities publicly, the community might finally rally against this tyrannical leader. By the end of the week, Ethan's investigation had taken on a life of its own. With his evidence neatly organized, he scheduled a meeting with a trusted attorney and prepared to contact local media. Karen's once impenetrable facade was beginning to crack, and Ethan was determined to fan those cracks into an open wound. That night, as the neighborhood settled into uneasy sleep, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The HOA wasn't just targeting him, they were targeting the very idea of individual rights in a community that was slowly being strangled by entitlement and corruption. Early one rainy morning, Ethan awoke to an alarming scene. Heavy machinery was parked in front of his house, and the sound of digging echoed from his driveway. As he rushed outside, rain mingling with his mounting anger, he saw that a section of his driveway had been torn up, allegedly to expand the sidewalks in a misguided beautification project. The deed was not only unapproved, but it also endangered the integrity of his property. In that moment, Ethan realized that Karen had crossed a line. "Stop," he shouted, dashing toward the scene. The foreman paused, and Karen appeared at the edge of the property, her eyes hard and unyielding. "This is for the good of the community," she insisted, gesturing to the equipment. "Your driveway is obstructing our plans." "You're trespassing on my property," Ethan countered, voice trembling with equal parts indignation and controlled fury. "I have all the legal documents that state you have no authority to alter my land without my permission." Karen's response was immediate and chilling. "You're in violation of the HOA standards. We have the right to act swiftly." Her tone suggested that defiance was not an option. As Ethan watched, a tow truck, previously hidden behind the machinery, crept forward to hook up his car parked near the entrance. Shocked and disbelieving, Ethan called out, "What are you doing with my car?" A chorus of voices emerged from the gathering crowd of onlookers. Neighbors who had come out to see what the commotion was all about whispered among themselves, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. Some recognized the injustice of the situation. In the midst of the chaos, Ethan pulled out his phone and began recording. At the next HOA meeting, held in the cramped community center, the room was charged with tension. Ethan strode in, clutching a thick file of legal documents and photographic evidence of the morning's debacle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice resonant and calm, "I stand before you with proof that the actions taken by our HOA today are not only illegal, but represent an abuse of power." He laid out the documents for all to see, his evidence irrefutable. The crowd grew restless. Whispers turned into murmurs of discontent. Several board members exchanged uneasy looks. Karen, however, maintained her composure. "These documents mean nothing," she snapped. "The HOA's decisions are final." But Ethan pressed on. "The law is clear. No entity can alter private property without proper consent. Today's actions amount to outright trespassing and theft." His words cut through the room like a knife. A board member from the back hesitated before admitting, "I didn't know any of this was happening." Karen's face flushed with anger as she realized her grip was slipping. "I have my orders," she hissed. "Orders that come from the board, and orders that are supported by our community's best interests." Her voice wavered, betraying the mounting pressure. Yet as Ethan continued detailing the evidence, the tow truck's unauthorized actions, the machinery encroaching on his property, and the blatant disregard for due process, the tide began to turn. One neighbor, emboldened by Ethan's clarity, stood up. "If this is what our HOA does, then when will our rights be respected?" The sentiment rippled through the room. By the end of the meeting, a palpable shift had occurred. Karen's confident facade was replaced by a strained defensiveness as the board and community members began questioning her authority. Ethan's public confrontation, backed by undeniable proof and legal clarity, had shaken the very foundations of the HOA's power. Outside the meeting hall, as the rain slowed to a drizzle, Ethan quietly collected his thoughts. He knew that Karen's methods would only grow more desperate, and that his next moves would need to be even more strategic. But for now he had struck back not with anger, but with truth and unwavering resolve. As the community began to murmur about the possibility of reform, Ethan allowed himself a small, determined smile. The battle was far from over, yet in that moment, he had reclaimed a measure of his rightful power. When Karen realized that her usual tactics were no longer effective, she grew desperate. In a final audacious bid to assert her authority, she concocted a scheme that she thought would force Ethan into submission. Early one Saturday morning, just as the neighborhood was stirring awake, Karen phoned the local police. Her voice, trembling with a mix of indignation and panic, reported that Ethan's porch lights were causing a public disturbance, a claim so ludicrous that even the dispatcher paused. Before the police could arrive, Ethan was already on his porch, having anticipated another attempt at intimidation. As the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars neared, Ethan calmly stepped outside, pulling his city official badge from his jacket. When an officer approached, Karen was there, attempting to look authoritative as she reiterated her baseless claim. Officer Daniels raised an eyebrow as Ethan calmly identified himself. "Sir, I'm a city official. I assure you my porch lights comply with all local ordinances." "Karen, these are not a public nuisance. They're part of my property's character." The officer exchanged a knowing glance with Ethan, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, it appears there's been a misunderstanding. I'll need to verify this claim further, but in the meantime, I suggest you refrain from further harassment." Karen's face fell as the officer's words sank in. But she wasn't finished. Determined to salvage her position, she turned to a new tactic, hiring a private investigator to dig up any dirt on Ethan. Late one night, when the neighborhood was cloaked in darkness, a shadowy figure was seen creeping around Ethan's garage. Unbeknownst to Karen, Ethan had installed additional security cameras after the recent incidents. Reviewing the footage the next morning, Ethan was shocked to see the private investigator discreetly rummaging through his personal belongings, an act that constituted illegal trespassing. At the next HOA meeting, still simmering from the previous confrontations, Ethan brought along the damning video evidence. With the room packed tight and every eye on him, he played the security footage on a projector. The grainy video clearly showed the investigator creeping along Ethan's garage, reaching for personal items. A hush fell over the crowd as the evidence unfolded on the screen. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. "This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered, but the damage was done. Neighbors who had once silently tolerated her authoritarian style now erupted in murmurs of disbelief and outrage. Ethan seized the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the room, his voice echoing with controlled passion, "what you just witnessed is a blatant violation of my rights, a clear act of trespassing orchestrated by someone I suspect was acting on orders from our HOA." His words rippled through the audience, and the atmosphere shifted from tense to charged with anticipation. An elderly homeowner, who had long felt intimidated by Karen's antics, rose and asked, "When will we say enough is enough?" The room filled with nods and murmurs of approval. Even a couple of board members looked visibly troubled as they exchanged furtive glances. Karen, realizing that her desperate attempt had backfired, tried to regain control. I was only trying to protect the community's interests," she pleaded, but her voice wavered under the collective scrutiny. Ethan's final words at that meeting were calm and resolute. "I stand by my right to live peacefully and according to the law. We will no longer tolerate bullying in our community." The room burst into applause, an emphatic rejection of Karen's final, desperate move. As the meeting concluded, Karen's fate seemed sealed. Not only had her baseless accusations been disproven by law enforcement and clear security evidence, but her actions had also exposed the true nature of the HOA's abuse of power. Ethan's calm professionalism and unwavering commitment to justice had turned the tide, leaving Karen scrambling to defend herself against mounting legal and public pressure. Outside, as neighbors congratulated Ethan on his steadfast stand, he couldn't help but feel a bittersweet victory. Karen's tactics had not only failed, they had become the very evidence that would ensure her downfall. And while he knew the battle was far from over, that day marked the turning point where truth began to outweigh tyranny. In the wake of Karen's public debacle, the community began to stir with a newfound sense of unity and purpose. The incident at the HOA meeting spread quickly. Neighbors exchanged copies of the security footage, and heated discussions erupted on community message boards. The once feared Karen was now the subject of ridicule and condemnation, and her hold on the HOA began to crumble. Within days, a coalition of frustrated homeowners formed. They convened in living rooms and backyards, pooling evidence of abuse and rallying around the idea of reclaiming their community. Ethan, whose calm determination had inspired many, found himself at the center of this grassroots movement. "We deserve a neighborhood where our voices matter, not one ruled by arbitrary rules and intimidation," he told an impromptu gathering at the local park. "Karen's actions have shown us that we must stand up against tyranny, wherever we see it." At the next formal HOA meeting, now crowded with concerned residents. The atmosphere was electric with resolve. The board, once dominated by Karen's loyalists, was challenged by homeowners demanding accountability. With documents, security footage, and testimony in hand, Ethan led a charge to force a vote of no confidence against Karen. The room, which had once echoed with Karen's self-assured commands, now buzzed with dissenting voices. Under the weight of overwhelming evidence and public pressure, even long-time board members began to waver. One by one, they admitted that Karen's decisions often lacked transparency and legal grounding. "I never thought we'd be forced to reconsider the leadership of our HOA," a soft-spoken board member confessed, her eyes downcast as she shifted her support to the reform movement. The vote came swiftly and decisively. In a show of unity that resonated throughout the community, the majority of homeowners voted to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. That evening, as the final tally was announced, Karen was forced to step down. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and triumphant celebration from the assembled residents. Karen's personal downfall didn't end there. News of the scandal and the city's subsequent investigation into the HOA's practices spread quickly. Local authorities, now armed with the evidence Ethan had meticulously gathered, began to look into other questionable practices within the organization. Rumors of misappropriated funds, illegal fines, and even corrupt contracts surfaced. Within a week, the HOA found itself under a full-scale legal probe. Fines were levied, board members were summoned for questioning, and several contracts were declared null and void. Amid the turmoil, Karen's once proud residence became a symbol of her rapid fall from grace. Overnight, her stately home was put up for sale by the board in an effort to recoup misused funds. Neighbors whispered that the house would soon stand empty, a monument to the abuse of power that had once reigned over their community. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. He had never sought personal glory. His battle was always about protecting the rights of every homeowner. As he sat on his well-lit porch one cool morning, he sipped his coffee and watched as the community began to rebuild trust. The oppressive shadow of the HOA had finally been lifted, replaced by the promise of transparency and fairness. In quiet moments, Ethan reflected on how quickly power could be abused, and how easily that abuse could be exposed when the community stood together. The downfall of the HOA and Karen wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a reaffirmation that even the most overbearing authorities could be held accountable. And as neighbors passed by, shaking his hand and offering words of gratitude, Ethan allowed himself a small smile. Today, his porch lights shone a little brighter, not as a symbol of defiance, but as a beacon of justice finally restored. In the weeks following Karen's removal, the full weight of legal action came crashing down on the now discredited HOA. With mounting evidence in hand, local authorities launched a rigorous investigation into the board's operations. The community watched closely as lawsuits were filed against the HOA for illegally enforcing non-existent rules and for extorting exorbitant fines. Ethan, whose persistence had sparked the movement, worked with a group of residents to file a class action suit. Their legal team meticulously detailed every violation, from unauthorized alterations of private property to the misuse of HOA funds for personal luxuries. In one courtroom, a judge sternly rebuked the board for overstepping its legal authority, and fines were imposed that threatened to dissolve the entire organization. A series of public hearings were held, and the once feared HOA was dismantled piece by piece. Several board members were summoned to testify, and some even faced personal legal consequences for their involvement in corrupt practices. The State Bar also opened an inquiry into Karen's lawyer, a man whose complicity in the HOA's misdeeds had come under harsh scrutiny. Throughout the legal proceedings, Ethan maintained his composure. His final power move wasn't one of vengeance, but of principled action. He ensured that every piece of evidence was shared publicly, so that no future board could hide behind bureaucratic language or secretive meetings. Transparency is the only antidote to tyranny, he stated in a press conference that drew local media attention. His measured words resonated deeply with residents across the county. By the time the court delivered its final verdict, The HOA was fined heavily and forced to restructure entirely. Its assets were liquidated to compensate affected homeowners, and a new governance model was proposed, one that promised oversight, accountability, and true representation for every resident. Though the legal battle had been long and arduous, the end result was a clear message. Abuse of power would not be tolerated. For Ethan and his neighbors, this wasn't merely a legal victory. It was a fundamental reclaiming of their rights as property owners and community members. As the legal proceedings drew to a close, Karen's personal life began to mirror the collapse of her public empire. No longer shielded by her position as HOA president, she found herself isolated and under constant scrutiny. The once powerful enforcer now faced a series of humiliating setbacks. Within days of her ouster, Karen's personal assets came under investigation. Rumors spread that her car, an ostentatious vehicle that had once symbolized her status, was in serious arrears. It wasn't long before the repossession notice arrived, and the sleek car was whisked away in front of an unimpressed crowd of former admirers. The humiliation was compounded when her husband, long frustrated by her relentless need for control, filed for divorce. The dissolution of their marriage became yet another public spectacle, as neighbors whispered about the irony of Karen's downfall. In a final twist of poetic justice, Karen was seen at a local city hall meeting, pleading with officials to reinstate her authority. Her voice, once so commanding, now wavered with desperation as she argued for a reconsideration of her previous fines. But the officials were unmoved. The evidence of her misconduct was overwhelming. "I'm sorry, ma'am," one official stated firmly, "but the law is clear, and so is your record." Karen's new job, an assistant property manager at another HOA, was perhaps the most painful irony of all. Forced to report to someone who upheld the very standards she had once so brazenly ignored, she found herself on the receiving end of the rules. At every meeting, as she took notes on policies she'd once enforced, the echoes of her former tyranny haunted her. One day, while passing a particularly strict regulation, she muttered, "I hope you like following the rules," a bitter reminder of her fall from power. For many in the community, Karen's downfall served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitlement and abuse of power. The once dictatorial figure was now reduced to a cautionary example, her every misstep documented and dissected in community forums and local news. And for Ethan, it was a final chapter in a long struggle, a vindication that integrity and justice always prevail. Months later, the neighborhood had settled into a newfound harmony. Gone were the days of arbitrary fines and overbearing regulations. In their place stood a community united by transparency, accountability, and a shared commitment to individual rights. Ethan Carter's porch lights shone softly each evening, not as a symbol of defiance, but as a warm beacon welcoming friends and neighbors alike. One crisp evening, as Ethan sat on his porch sipping his favorite brew, a neighbor strolled over with a playful grin. "Hey, Ethan," they joked, "I just got an HOA notice, apparently. You're now in violation for having the world's friendliest porch." Laughter broke out among the group, a gentle reminder of how far they'd come. Ethan's smile was wry and knowing. "I guess some things never change," he quipped, his tone light yet imbued with the satisfaction of hard-fought victory. The community's shared humor was not just a celebration of their newfound freedom, but also a silent rebuke to those who once thrived on control and fear. In the weeks that followed, the echoes of the old regime faded away. The HOA was reformed under community oversight, and the names of those who had once terrorized their neighbors became mere footnotes in local history. Every so often, a resident would receive a mock notice, an inside joke that served as a nod to the past and a reminder of the power of collective action. As twilight descended and the first stars appeared in the sky, Ethan took one final look at his peaceful street. The battles fought, and one had reshaped not just his life, but the very fabric of the community. In a quiet, almost cinematic moment, he mused to himself, "Justice isn't given. It's earned by standing up when it matters most." And with that, the camera of life zoomed out from one humble, well-lit porch to reveal an entire neighborhood, united in laughter and hope, a testament to the idea that even the most overbearing power can be toppled when ordinary citizens choose to rise up. Fade to black.